Greetings, DMs, GMs, and players. This is the Insomniac GM, and today this is another part of my introduction to tabletop role-playing games. Now, figured before I dove a little bit deeper into some of the other things, like actual mechanics or the roles of the GM, the players, all that, I figured one thing I should cover so there's a bit more of an understanding with my channel is additions. So we've already gone over game systems, but then there's also additions. So one way to explain additions is think of a video game franchise. Okay, so Halo may be different from Mortal Kombat because they're two different games, just kind of like Dungeons and Dragons and Call of Cthulhu. But then you have different entries into the same game system, kind of like how Halo has multiple games. So does Dungeons and Dragons and others, and they change up the rules. So I wanted to demonstrate this to you. Now, unfortunately, I don't have Dungeons & Dragons 1st or 2nd edition, but Lamentations of the Flame Princess is Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition rules with a few extra rules, so it's pretty similar. So I ended up grabbing that one. So the rules are going to be a little different, but essentially this is going to be your Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition. So what I did is I created the same character in Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition, or Lamentations, 3rd edition, 4th edition, and 5th edition to show you the differences. What I did is I rolled the stats in order: 16, 8, 11, 12, 14, and 15. How you roll these stats is you roll 4 6-sided dice, you take away the lower number and you add them together and you write it down, and you do that 6 times. So I stuck with halfling. If you don't know what a halfling is, think the Hobbit from Lord of the Rings. It's, in fact, from what I heard in 1st edition, it's actually called a Hobbit until like they ended up going after them to change the name. But now later on I will explain. I chose rogue. We'll go over that, but I'm gonna keep this right here off to the side so you know. Now, Lamentations of the Flame Princess. You have 7 classes. You have the mage, the fighter, the thief, or rogue, I believe. It's thief. And cleric, elf, dwarf, and halfling. I decided to go halfling because I figured this would show it real well, and I didn't want to touch on magic. So, halfling. So, in Lamentations of the Flame Princess, or 1st edition Dungeons & Dragons, you do not choose a race. A race is technically its own class. So I went with halfling for this. So I rolled the stats in order from highest to, or in order to what I rolled. So 16, 8, 11, 12, 14, and 15. Now the modifiers in the other editions are much lower. So for instance, I will point out that if you look, our highest stat, which is a 16, is a +2. Now, in 1st edition, you're supposed to roll your stats in order. Cool. Now, another thing, your saves. You have 5 different saves. So say your DM tells you, oh, a dragon breathes fire on you, make a save. You go through and you go, okay, well, is it a paralyze? No. Is it a poison? No. Is that breath? Yes. So then you roll and you want to get a 13 or higher on a 20-sided die. Max health. 2. I should mention all these characters I made are level 1. So you only do 2 damage. Or, I mean, you only have 2 hit points. And if I remember correctly with the Lamentations, you die at 0. Or, like, you die at 0 if you're at 0 hit points and if anyone doesn't come to rescue you within the end of within that combat. So the second the combat ends, you're dead. Armor class 14, so your opponent needs to get a 14 or higher to hit you. Now I will say, not to confuse you, one thing Lamentations does different than first edition is in Lamentations, the higher your number is for your armor class, the better. In first edition, they went the lower, the better. Another thing they did too different is this whole skill system, but I'm not going to really touch that because I don't want to make this into a Lamentations video. But, so, there's one thing. Now, remember, 16 for Charisma is a +2. Now, we go into 3rd edition. So, 3rd edition, this is where we start getting very crunchy with the rules. So now you get to choose what class you want to be. So, Halfling is no longer a class, it is a race. So, we chose Halfling, and we chose Rogue. So, part of being a Halfling, you now get a plus to your roll, and you get a minus to your, or a plus to a stat and a minus to a stat. So Dexterity got a +2, Strength got a -2, and those numbers we rolled before, we are now allowed to put them wherever we wanted. So before I showed you a 16 was a +2. Well, if you look in here, my con is a 14, that's a +2. You go with my 18, that's a +4. If I had 16 in this, it would be a +3. I don't want to go too much into it to confuse you. Just stick with whatever system you end up playing or whatnot. But I just wanted to show you that the power is a much higher in these other games now. And we are now going into Rogue. So, before we had 2 hit points, now we got 5. What I should mention too is when making these characters, if it required me to roll for health at level 1, I took the average of what that roll would be. If it tells me to max it, I maxed it. Well, this and Lamentations told me to roll it, so you're going to see lower health on these 2 characters. Now, the skills I was talking about on this is all of 3rd editions. It's all about skills. Now, there's a bunch of other little mechanics, like you have like grappling, you have the base attack bonus. Now, saves, instead of having the 5, once again, with the Dragon's Fire Breath, it's now only 3. So are you making a Fortitude save, a Reflex save, or a Will? You're going to use a Reflex to dodge out of that Dragon's Fire Breath. I should also mention, all these halflings, they have leather armor. Instead of an armor class of 14, I now have an armor class of 16. There's also rules for having a touch armor class, a flat-footed armor class. This is just part of the rules of the mechanics of the game. Now, I should mention in the other character sheet that I had, it had a section for equipment. Same with this, but I'm showing this because it also has a section for some of your abilities. So that you will be using it too. So now we're already starting to see somewhat of a difference. I should also point out skills. You're adding whatever modifier it tells you to put in. So for instance, my dexterity, is a +4, so I add 4. I put in 2 ranks, that makes it a 6, and then I end up getting a +3 with another rule in the game. So that becomes a 9. So I add 9 to whatever I roll, and that's how all the skills work. So now we're going to go into 4th edition. Now, there are 2 different versions of 4th edition. There's D&D 4e, and then there's D&D Essentials. I went with Essentials just because there's not as many choices. I wanted to make these characters rather fast, and Essentials is received a lot better. But, so, with this, once again, going with the 16, 8, 11, 12, 14, and 15, same thing here. However, the halfling, once again, being its own thing, does not get a -2 in anything. It gets a +2 in Dex and a +2 in Charisma. You're given a choice of either Con or Charisma. I went Charisma. So you end up looking at these stats and that. Same modifiers, you know. You have Dexterity, that's an 18. It's still a 4. Still the Fortitude, Reflex, and Will saves. But instead of, like if you look here, Reflex is a 2, so you roll it and you add 2. Reflex on here is a 14, so your opponent's rolling an attack on that number or higher. So this one, you're rolling, that one, your opponent rolls to hit you. Armor class is actually 15 this time, so 1 point lower than 3.5. They use the number of squares you can move now instead of your actual speed, because in Lamentations, my speed I did not write down. I think. Did I write it down? I did not write it down. I don't know. But I can tell you 3rd edition, my speed is 20, which that would be 4 squares. With this, it just tells me how many squares. Now, I also get the skills are much smaller this time around, and there's not as much like floating numbers going around in that. So, once again, like, we'll use, because a lot of them are gone, like, it's different. So, in this one, we'll use, I'll use Dungeoneering. It uses my Wisdom, which is a -1, and because I'm trained in it, I get a +5. So I add 4 to everything I roll that's Dungeoneering. Now, I have abilities. Now, abilities in here, you have your utility ones, where they dabble into each one of these. And then you have your at will, you have your encounter, and you have your daily. And at will, you can use that ability infinity times. Encounter abilities, you can only use it once per combat, or you got to take a 10-minute rest. And then daily, so you can only cast that once per 24 hours. This one's also a lot heavier on magic items. 3rd edition has a lot of magic items, but 4th edition's a lot more punishing if you don't have them. So there's another thing I should point out too is all these stats later on will become much higher, because as you level up, you add half of your level. Well, because I'm level 1, I'm not adding anything to it. But say you're level 20, all of these stats are going to pretty much increase. Almost all these stats are going to increase by 10, which is half of 20. One other thing I should point out before I go to the next character sheet is now my HP at level 1 is 14 compared to my 5 HP 3.5 character and my 2 hit point first edition character. And you have a number of times you can heal in the day, being 8. You have 8 charges, and each one of those charges you use, you end up healing 3 hit points. Now we come to the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Once again, you don't need to roll the stats in order. So, modifiers are the same, 18 plus 4. This time, however, the halfling gets a +2 to dexterity, and you have sub-races of halfling. I chose the Lightfoot halfling, so I get a +1 on charisma compared to the +2 charisma for you. The skills are increased a little bit more. They got rid of the fort, reflex, and will save. They now have strength, dexterity, con, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So it just uses your modifier, and you have your proficiency bonus. So in 4th edition, your proficiency bonus is half your level, and this, it's +2, and after you reach, I think it was level 5, it becomes +4, and so on and so forth. In 5th edition, you end up gaining, or I started off with 12 hit points, so it's not as high as 4th edition's, which 4th edition and 5th edition both do not have you roll your health at first level. In fact, 4th edition does not have you roll your health at any level. It becomes a static number as you go, and from what I was seeing with the number, you get a lot more health at level 1, and essentially as you level up, that health causes you to it makes the game more difficult as you go, because it drops a lot on how much you gain. Now, my speed is 25 in this. My armor class is 15, so it's the same as 4th edition. And I don't have as many abilities. Now, one thing I should point out is halfling in 1st edition is like very survival based. You're good at finding, like, scavenging for like berries and all that kind of stuff. 3rd edition, I don't think I had like any crazy. 3rd edition gave me like little floating bonuses, and 4th edition gave me little floating bonuses, and like a bonus to like my AC if I'm running. 5th edition gives you once per day, or sorry, it gives you the ability to reroll any 1 you get. You know, I got some skills that cause my skills to be rolled much higher than others. Not as much sneak attack damage as 4th edition, and I don't know about 3rd edition. But, oh no, it's the same as 3rd editions. One other thing I should point out that I did forget to mention, I mentioned Lamentations death rules, but in 3.5, essentially, you die when you reach a negative number equal to your con, which is 14. So if you reach negative 14, you die. In 4th edition, see, I haven't actually gotten to play this, but I believe it's like you drop to 0 and you do death saves. Now on this one, you gotta make 3 failed death saves, or you reach a negative equal to your health. Also, character sheet, 4th edition introduced it later on in the game. You can use it if you want to or not. I didn't include it because it's optional, but you can add backgrounds. And 5th edition has that as a core mechanic. So you choose a background, you get some bonuses on skills, you get like some little narrative ability. And your character sheet now is 3 pages long, which I personally don't know anyone who uses the 2nd character sheet. But and then the 3rd character sheet, which is all spells. So all of these games I just showed you, they are all Dungeons and Dragons. And you can kind of see how different all the games are. You know, I wish I could talk more on 2nd edition, but I never bothered to really pick up 2nd edition, not because I hate it or anything, but just because I got so many fantasy settings, and for the most part, I heard it's very similar to 1st edition. Meanwhile, I pick up multiple copies of like 1st edition retro clones. But yeah, so here's my little recommendation. I will say, if you are new to the hobby, I would recommend 5th edition. It's a lot simpler. It's a lot harder to die in the game. 4th edition, although it's not 4th edition, I'm a little overwhelmed with like a few things. I shouldn't say overwhelmed. I feel like a few things like slow down the game, which I guess I should just show you guys. I make my own character sheets if I don't like how something is. And I've actually created my own 4th edition character sheet to simplify it. But 4th edition, I think, is great if you want to play large-scale warlike games. Your DM can send a lot more enemies after you all at once. Kind of gives me like a Dynasty Warriors feel in a way. And then 3rd edition, you customize your character very detailed to little things. It's very bloaty, but I love it if you get into it. And then you got 1st edition, which is the most simplified version. It's very friendly at letting your players be creative with how they want to solve things. And it's a lot more lethal. You know, you send some goblins after your players at first level. They're going to try to figure out how to get out of that fight, and then how they're going to ambush the goblins later, and how they want to go about it with as many goblins dying before they charge in. You play the other editions, and it kind of encourages more of a let's charge in and fight attitude. But yeah, that's the different editions. And so if you hear me talk about editions in these future videos, this is what I'm talking about. Different versions of the same game. They're like sequels to the game. Kind of like I stated earlier with Halo having like the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th game, you know? So tell me, what's your favorite game system? What's your favorite game edition if you're already playing one? If you're a new player, tell me in the comments, like, out of the videos you've seen of mine or games you've heard from people, what game and edition interests you? Until next time, take care.